Right, good evening. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Nicholas Boyce-Smith. A very warm welcome on this spring, not that warm spring evening. I'm the Director of Create Streets. Welcome to the third in our Planning Forward series of webinars about the future of planning and placemaking and the quality of the lives we lead. A huge thank you to the University of Birmingham, Institute for Global Innovation and the Transition Network for kindly sponsoring this evening's fascinating and I think incredibly important conversation about air quality, breathe free. That's all you're going to get from me. I'd like to hand over to our chair, Dr Suzanne Bartington, who is a clinical research fellow in environmental health at the University of Birmingham and also leads the Transition Clean Air Network, that's hard to say, which spans 9 UK universities, Public Health England and over 20 cross-sector partners with a huge focus on air quality. And she's co-lead, along with another of our panelists, for the University of Birmingham Institute for Global Innovation Clean Air theme. So thank you. And Suzanne, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, and a warm welcome to everyone joining us this evening. We're absolutely delighted to be here for the Breathe Free event as part of the Create Streets Planning Forward webinar series. As outlined, this is supported by the University of Birmingham Institute for Global Innovation, which seeks to address the world's most pressing challenges, including our internationally leading clean air research, engagement and policy impact activities. Also supported this evening by the Transition Clean Air Network, which seeks to deliver solutions for indoor and outdoor quality across UK land transport. So I'm pleased we have an excellent lineup of speakers this evening for exploring this really important topic of air quality in our towns and cities, particularly looking forward to the planning white paper and thinking of the vision for our towns and cities in the future. But we want tonight to be an interactive event, so please do get involved. You can post your questions in the question and answer function for our experts. And also we'll have some live polling throughout the event, and all these answers are anonymous. We'll display them live as they come in, and this also helps generate insights into the challenge of air pollution and the wider understanding of air quality. You can also follow the discussion online on Twitter using the hashtag #BreatheFree. So without further ado, I'd like to move on to our first questions here on clean air awareness and air pollution sources. So firstly, have you heard of Clean Air Day? And please click on the answer on the screen and submit your question. Excellent. We obviously have a well-informed audience with us here. So over half who've heard of Clean Air Day, which is being held on the 17th of June this year and is supported and delivered by Global Action Plan with cross-sector activities. Our next question focuses on the sources of air quality. So before we hear from the experts, we want to hear what you think about the major sources of air pollution in the UK. So up to 3 answers here. And hopefully we should have the results through very shortly. Quite a challenging question, I think. Interesting set of results. So vehicle exhausts top the list there. And we've also got factories and open fires, so industry and open fires following, I think, in second place, along with agricultural activity there. So very interesting. I think we can explore and pick up on these further in the question and also in the discussion section of our event. I'd like to move on to our first speaker now, who is Professor William Bloss from the University of Birmingham, who is Professor of Atmospheric Science, and hopefully will be shedding some further insight onto those major sources of air pollution.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne, for that introduction. Can I just check you can see my screen correctly? Is that sharing appropriately? Great. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Nicholas, and to Create Streets for the opportunity to speak this evening. I want to spend just a few minutes outlining how clean the air in our cities is at the moment before we go on to think a little bit more about the future. But I want to start off by stepping a little bit into the past. So if we looked back, say, 150 years to the West Midlands, where I'm speaking from this evening, the landscape was rather different from what we're familiar with today. And I've got a little quote on the screen there, which was from a 13-year-old then Princess Victoria on her first visit to the Black Country, when apparently she had to close the train windows because she was assaulted by the pungent atmosphere prevailing at that time. Then, of course, we continued with the air quality challenges maybe reaching their peak, certainly in awareness terms, in the London smog events of the 1950s, which are apparently a very busy time for thieves, and which led to the National Clean Air Acts, which moved some of the then sources of pollution out of our cities, and our air arguably became a lot cleaner. And this is a picture of present-day Birmingham city centre. But we still live in a landscape today where people will pay $26.95 plus shipping to buy a bottle of air from Canada, which apparently has a ready market out there, and where we have headlines like this. So the initial question I just want to explore a bit is the glass half full or half empty, and how clean is our air at the moment? So in the present day, we're interested in two main air pollutants. We're interested in nitrogen dioxide gas, or NO2, and we're interested in fine particles, PM, and particularly PM 2.5. So you can see the graphic there comparing the size of different particles with a human hair. PM10 are the blue ones, which are small enough to breathe into our upper airways. And the PM 2.5 are the very smallest ones, which penetrate deep into our lungs and alveoli. And together, the NO2 and PM 2.5 give rise to the haze we sometimes see above our cities, and the current health burden from air pollution, alongside a few other species. So if we think about where they each come from, if you can see this pie chart, it's showing the sources of nitrogen dioxide, of NO2. And the big green bit on the left-hand side is local road traffic. So this is sources in a city centre. And if we zoom in on that green bit, the right-hand side shows you the contribution from diesel cars, diesel vans, diesel HGVs, and diesel buses. So there's a bit of a clue there as to what we're looking at. And for NO2, the overwhelming source in our cities is traffic, and particularly diesel-powered traffic. Got to be a little bit careful when we talk about buses and transport vehicles, as they shift a lot of people compared with individual cars. And maybe come back to that a little bit later on. For fine particles, the situation is a bit more complex. You won't be able to read what's on the pie chart here, but the point is there's lots of different sectors of the economy contributing to the fine particle levels in our cities. And I've listed some of them there, and they reflect a lot of the areas that we picked out in the poll that Suzanne ran a couple of minutes ago. Transport, but also power generation, industry, combustion, domestic heating, wood burning, cooking, agriculture, as well as natural sources. I think it's quite interesting to have a look at levels of these pollutants, as that tells us quite a lot about how we can approach solving some of the challenges. So if we look at a map of where we see nitrogen dioxide, and for those who aren't familiar, this is a map of the West Midlands, and the big red line you can see is the M6, the line on the left is the M5, and this is Birmingham and Coventry city centre. So the point is the NO2 map looks like a map of the road network, and that reflects the dominant sources of NO2 being from road traffic. If we think about how it varies during the day, we can get quite an interesting insight as well. So we run an air quality super site, and one of the things we do is measure the variation in NO2 levels during the day. And the graph here shows you the NO2 levels over a 24-hour period. The purple line at the top is a roadside location in Birmingham city centre. And the red and blue lines are in the suburbs. The blue is on the university campus in Birmingham, and the red one is a few miles away. So you can see several things from this graph. You can see a peak in the morning and a peak in the afternoon from the rush hour when everyone goes to work. You can see everyone goes to work at more or less the same time, but a few people slope off a little bit early in the afternoon. But the thing that's most interesting is there's a big gap between the purple line and the red and the blue ones. The levels are much higher in the city centre at the roadside location. And what that shows us is that the way we arrange things locally, our local approaches to planning our cities and where we put the traffic, can alter the air quality we experience, and there's scope for local actions and plans. We can look at the same sort of thing for PM 2.5, but in this case, the three lines overlap and blur into one another. And that's because the fine particles tend to last longer in the air and be spread a little more evenly around. Levels are higher in cities, but not to the same extent as NO2. So when we come to tackle fine particles, it's important we have a combination of local interventions, but also effective regional and national policies to tackle the wider sources. So that's a little bit about what we care about in our cities and where it comes from. Just to touch on what this is doing to us. Nitrogen dioxide has a range of health impacts, particularly affecting the respiratory system, our breathing. And fine particles also have cardiovascular impacts, and there's emerging evidence of effects in pregnancy and on cognition and potentially dementia. So there's a range of really quite significant health impacts that affect us, and as are captured in a little cartoon there, affect different aspects of our bodies. And it's a hard thing to put numbers on, but the estimates are that we have a mortality burden from long-term exposure to air pollution equivalent to around 30,000 deaths each year, or up to 6 months of life expectancy loss. And I, for one, would kind of quite like that 6 months back again. So where are we at the moment in terms of our air quality limits? Well, there's a long and complicated table of air quality limits, but we can't read that here. So if we zoom in, the key points at the moment are how our NO2 levels compare with an annual average level of 40, measured in units of micrograms per meter cube, but that doesn't matter. And how our PM 2.5 levels compare with the current UK limit of 25, or the current World Health Organization limit of 10, guideline level. And that little asterisk there is to remind me to say the World Health Organization is reviewing these limits at the moment. So in our cities, we have problems in some bigger cities meeting that NO2 standard, and at some roadside locations. Most places meet the 25 level for PM 2.5, but many, probably the majority of cities, fail the World Health Organization guideline level. And two things to bear in mind on that. One, if you can see it, the regulations were due to be met by 2005. So we are 16 years late so far in meeting the NO2 limits. And secondly, and importantly, the evidence is pretty clear that there's no health threshold. So we gain health benefits the cleaner we make our air. It's not a case that 41 is bad and 39 is good. So I'll just finish with a couple of thoughts about the future. Our cities are evolving. The way we move around them is changing. The way we power them is changing. And in the wake of COVID, the way we use them is certainly changing quite dramatically. And a lot of that is going to influence the way we can design our neighborhoods and our cities for the future. One of the sort of rules of thumb we try and bear in mind is to try and reduce emissions of pollutants, failing that to extend the distance between pollutant sources and the receptors, the people affected, and failing that to look at measures to protect people, but to have that hierarchy or that order of measures to reduce, extend, protect as a rule of thumb. And we'll talk a little bit more in the rest of the webinar about positive steps, but I've just put one example of some guidance for people in the planning profession there on the slide. So I'll stop at that point and hand over to my fellow panelists to talk a little bit more about future steps and where we go from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill. Very, very interesting and demonstrates the complexity, really. So when we talk about sources of pollution, we need to think about the pollutant specifically, where people are living, and also exactly when we are measuring it as well. And hopefully we can visit that in the discussion. Please do put your questions for Bill in the Q&A, because then we can pick up on those. Now I'd like to welcome our second speaker this evening. I'm really pleased to have here Dr. Gary Fuller, who's one of the UK Clean Air champions and a senior lecturer in air quality management at Imperial College. And Gary's also the author of Invisible Killer, the book, and has a regular pollution watch column in The Guardian. So over to you, Gary.
Hello there, Suzanne. Thank you very much for inviting me along to talk. As Suzanne says, I'm at Imperial College London, and I also have a role as part of the Clean Air programme, which funds the Transition Network, where I'm a clean air champion. I wanted to talk about, I assume everyone can see my slides? Some nodding for affirmation. Great, thank you very much. I wanted to move on a little bit further and think about how we might move towards a smog-free city. Bill was talking about the health impacts of air pollution. And if we step away from the UK for a little while and think about this globally, air pollution is estimated to be responsible for about 4.9 million early deaths per year. Many of these are happening in places like India, China, and that part of the world. But if we total them all up, then air pollution is the 5th leading risk factor for mortality, ahead of other ones that are much more well known, such as alcohol use, malaria, and things like that, and road accidents as well. If you're interested in these sort of stats and background, check out the State of Global Air website, which is referenced there. Bring it to the UK. Bill talked about UK-wide figures, and here I've got some London ones. And between about 3,600 and 4,100 early deaths per year are happening in London due to the two pollutants, PM2.5 and NO2 that Bill was talking about. I think one of the things we often think about air pollution in a very abstract sense, it always seems to be statistics and statistics of life loss. And you may have read in the news about Ella Kissadebba, who died a few years ago, sadly, from some really severe asthma in southeast London, and she's now the first person to have air pollution listed as a cause of death on her death certificate. And you know, it raises a question of whether this will actually change the perspective away from abstract statistics down to actually reminding us that these are real people. These are actually individuals. I did this project a little while ago with The Guardian about what a smog-free city would look like, and just think about how to change the debate. For instance, we need to be moving away from just debating whether it's going to be petrol, diesel converts to electric, and think about getting rather than that, think about actually getting transport right, and about getting the right sort of mobility. Do we actually need all of the roads that we have in our urban areas? There's this example up here from Seoul in South Korea where they had a multi-lane motorway that just took traffic into the city centre, rather in some ways as like many of the structures you have in Birmingham. And to relieve congestion, well, they didn't build extra lanes on it. They just took the whole thing away. And underneath there was this river. So the people of Seoul now have this green transport corridor and a place that they can actually enjoy. And miraculously, the traffic in their city didn't actually get any worse. It didn't lead to awful congestion. So can we turn our roads into parks? We need to be paying a lot more attention to heating our home and what happens in the areas around us, our neighbours. Just looking at the potential here. My slides just disappeared. No, good, excellent. Something funny happened here. So there's huge potential to change, for instance, many of the short journeys that we do to active travel, to walking and cycling. There's these statistics here about the percentage of journeys that are done that are just less than 2 miles. And really you could walk or cycle faster than you could drive and park your car. One of the things I really like best is a study done on the people who are in UK Biobank, which is following and keeping in touch with about 400,000 people in the UK. Around 260,000 of these are actually workers. And when they tracked them and looked at their commuting methods, they found, just looking over a 5-year period, they could see that the cyclists were living longer. And those people who were walking to work had less heart disease compared to the car commuters. So even in a short time, it can reap some really real benefits. One of the other studies that should also make us think about active travel versus perhaps driving or other passive ways to get about comes from Barcelona, where they introduced the Bissing scheme some years ago with one of these cycle hire schemes. And the question they really said was, well, are we actually doing any good? Is there a risk that exposing people to accidents and all the air pollution, their extra air pollution they're breathing in by huffing and puffing their way around the crowded city streets is actually making the situation worse? Well, they weighed these up against the benefits from just the regular bit of exercise that people were getting through these short cycle rides, and they found that the benefits outweighed the risks by a ratio of about 70-1, which is just astonishing. Some later studies have looked at the same thing, but they've brought that number down a little bit, but still, undoubtedly, it's a lot more healthy for us. I often say if we can turn some of the journeys we make by car into active travel, walking and cycling, we have the opportunity to tackle air pollution, we have the opportunity to tackle climate change, opportunity to tackle the urban noise that plagues the lives of so many, as well as doing something about the fitness and the diseases of inactivity that plague our society. When we talk about transport, we often map it onto cars and personalised travel. But we also need to think about deliveries and freight. And there's a lot of that moving around and we don't pay it as much attention. We have bus services for moving people around. We have nothing for moving freight. And if we look in the freight system, it's really wrought with inefficiencies. TfL, Transport for London, did a study and found that 39% of the vans that were travelling around London were less than a quarter full. And, you know, perhaps that should bring about consolidation and ordering in our orders. But we really need to tackle this as well. Someone pointed out to me when I presented this that about a quarter of a van is almost exactly the load of one of these cycle delivery vehicles. One other thing as well you can simply do in your urban area if you want to reduce your exposure to air pollution is just don't walk along the busy roads. We had a project along Euston Road, and the majority of people, if you travel from West Midlands to central London, you might want to go between Euston and St Pancras, King's Cross, and most people walk along Euston Road where they share the air with about 80,000 vehicles a day. If you walk just one road back, your exposure to air pollution, a bit like those graphs Bill was showing, reduces by about half. So there's lots of things we can do, but we could also think about this in the way we're designing our cities. I do have to throw in a warning that not every solution that's being put forward to help our air pollution actually does any good at all. So there is, for instance, in China, this massive smog tower which is being built and supposedly is cleaning up the air of the whole of this city. But you know, you can see smog in the distance over the mountains. But for this tower to be actually sucking all this air through and cleaning this up, it's going to be sucking cars off the street. You know, this is just not happening. There's no way it stacks up. And similarly, we've got examples here in the UK. This mossy green wall is cleaning up apparently all of the air pollution at the top end of Regent Street. And this green wall here is protecting all the children from the air pollution on the traffic outside. It's not a solution. We have to tackle this at source. One of the other things in terms of urban design, which is really nice, is 15-minute neighborhoods. And I've only got a French illustration of this, but really putting everything we need to do on a daily basis within a 15-minute range of walking and cycling. And many of us being at home in pandemic at the moment are starting to learn about the things around us. Certainly I'm discovering bakers, butchers, greengrocers and things like that that I never really used so much before. Another thing as well, the big challenge, we've got COP26 this year. The huge challenge that's meant to be put before us is climate change. So how do we solve air pollution and climate change together? My late colleague, Martin Williams, really began to think about this and mapped out the different types of policy that we could be putting in place. And some of these are very bad for air pollution and climate. For instance, let's say coal-fired power stations, whereas some may not be entirely of benefits, like for instance biomass burning, urban CHP, dieselisation are sold because of a climate benefit, but they were bad for air pollution. So what we need to be doing is honing our policies for air pollution and climate so that they're all in this win-win area. And I'm going to add a third dimension to this, but I'm really rubbish with graphics, so you'll just have to forgive me here. And that third dimension is health benefit. For instance, if we were just to clean up the exhausts of the vehicles that are traveling around or convert them to electric, and we would have less air pollution and less climate change impacts, then yeah, you could say we might have solved both these problems. But if instead we were to create livable cities, and we will be able to encourage people to do active travel, not only could we sort out climate change and air pollution, but we could also improve the health of the population as a whole. So it's that type of honing we need in our cities moving forward. The website for our hosts here tonight, have a look at it. It's full of these fantastic images of places where you really want to be. But I brought along a few of my own and think this is what we want our urban areas to look like, and that's the vision we really need to have. But if we need to think a bit further, it's not just us that needs to solve these problems. I wrote this piece in The Guardian a couple of weeks ago, and the picture editor put this photograph that you can see there on it. And I'm a cyclist myself, and I was really struck by this man cycling along through thick smog in Delhi. And we need types of solutions that not only work for us in our urban areas, but we need solutions that are going to help this bloke trying to cycle along a busy road in Delhi. Because frankly, there's hundreds of millions of people out there across Indian cities who are exposed to awful levels of air pollution. So at that point, hopefully for whetting your appetite for the debate, I'm just going to say thank you very much, and put in a plug for my book if you'd like to go out and buy a copy, where I try and explore so many of these themes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gary. Many, many important points for us to pick up, particularly with regard to the future vision for our cities. And we're now going to move to really thinking about that planning and development perspective. And I'm really pleased that we have David Milner here, Deputy Director of Create Streets. But before he speaks, we'd like to hear from you and a specific question about buying your home in relation to air quality here. So please, again, respond on the screen, totally anonymous, and submit your answer. So we should have the results of that poll coming up now, hopefully. Very interesting. So quite a spread there about considering air quality, renting or buying your last home. So with that in mind now, over to David to think about our street scene and urban design.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. And just to check, have I got time to show the video as well before we get into my talk?
Yes, a short clip is fine, yeah.
No worries. Yeah, so I think sort of hearing the academic case from William and Gary is really interesting. We do a lot of work in co-design with communities, and a group that I've come across in the last few days I should have known about earlier is Choked Up, and I sort of really incredibly moving video, and I thought it was quite important, you know, to, as Gary did briefly, you know, to remind ourselves, you know, why this is important. So hopefully this will work. I'm going to share my screen now.
The toxic air we breathe currently remains the reason why we will be written off so abruptly. We risk being sealed in this fatal destiny, despite living in complete uncertainty. Although still treated like worthless commodities by those in authority, our voices and our names are out there, ready to uplift and amplify the rights of those in the most need. Collective strength is a product of adversity, and we're not backing down, not now, not ever. We're not going away. We won't cease to exist. We are not simply pretty statistics on a graph. We are choked up. The voices once hidden and shunned, but not anymore. Communities like yours and mine, and you know what I mean, are the forefront of this movement, and we all need each other to breathe easy. The fight for clean air is not designed to be fought alone, and it does not have just one direction. We can and we will take this in multiple directions. It's the fact that the people united will never be defeated. So no more to our voices being silent, no more to submitting to the silent killer, one that shapeshifts into subtleties that we breathe, so invisible yet so sneaky. But instead, here's to restoration, the start of a new life, where our rights and our health are considered priorities.
Thank you for letting me share that. I just think it's an incredibly powerful video, and I do sort of encourage people to follow them, chokedup_UK on Twitter. So, bring up my presentation now. So I've got the fun task of trying to think about planning reform and how that's going to potentially impact this, or what the important aspects of the new planning white paper and many of the different documents that are coming out are potentially going to impact this. This is a photo I took fairly close to where I live. It's Shepherd's Bush roundabout, and I'd argue this is planning of the past. Some of the different documents that have been coming out recently are starting to talk a lot more about air quality. I think this is something that's quite exciting. There are over 30, I've sort of lost count, but there are over 30 references in the Building Better, Building Beautiful report to air and clean air quality. And policy proposition 29 was, you know, pretty emphatic in talking about national car-free days, supporting more measurements. If you don't measure it, you're not going to improve it. Expanding bike networks, e-bike hire, more walkable towns and pedestrian neighbourhoods, which we'll come on to in a bit. Emission standards for cars, trying to increase more what's known as micro-mobility, so e-scooters and bikes. Legalising obviously those e-scooters as well is pretty important, and then trying to shift the traffic and shift some of this pollutant traffic away from the routes that you know, you or I will want to walk down, especially looking at schools. So here's the planning white paper. I think in terms of what's important here, and what did I pick out as being relevant for air quality, the talk of the different three areas. So you've got your growth areas, renewal areas, and your protect areas. There might be a chance here for gentle intensification, and this means that we can have more people living together, sharing more services, meaning that they can be closer to the shops, be close to the schools, be closer to the places they may work, and therefore be able to lead more sustainable lives and plant a few trees, as I can see shown on the way. The idea that we're trying to make it easier for smaller developers and more developers to get into the market rather than just a small number of the big boys, and that this can maybe help us, and we see Marmalade Lane here, get some more of the sustainably focused developers, which are going to be doing more creative things potentially, with regards to moving parking to one side and moving cars away from where we might want to live, where we might want to grow up, and where your children might want to grow up. So we've got a raft of updates and changes coming in. This is the National Model Design Code. I think here there's a real ability and a chance to scale some of the positive changes using coding to do this. I think there's a chance for strategic planning and to move away from what might be opportunistic planning. And one of the thoughts I had on this is we've heard in the planning and design community about different area zones where if you zone an area as an urban neighborhood or a suburban neighborhood or a high street, that actually can we link this to clean air zones? Can we make it mandatory that if you zone this as one type of neighborhood, there are stricter air quality limits on this? And also you can imagine bringing in automatic 20 miles an hour speed limits to slow the speeds of cars and make this a nicer place to walk linked to that. There's a chance that we can embed throughout the country and throughout the boroughs, and when we get down into the district layer, the layouts that allow you to walk more easily. So moving away from the cul-de-sacs, which to be frank, you don't have direct routes to walk to the shops, therefore you just won't want to. It's not pleasant to do it, it's difficult and indirect. This is an example of the road layout in Vauban, which is a suburb of Freiburg, and you can see that you've got a sort of very coarse road network and then a slightly finer local streets network where you're not allowed to kind of park and it's discouraged and it's not as easy to drive around. And then you have this really fine network of pedestrian and cycle streets. And it really makes you think, okay, for this journey, maybe I'll leave the car at home, maybe I'll just walk this journey and save those emissions. And this then obviously allows you to do other interesting things such as narrow the streets, plant more street trees, and then you can see the environments really can get improved. Why is it important, to increase density? Well, I see, we've got Siena on the left, which is obviously a home and employment centre for thousands of people, and then Houston, the interchange on the right. I see the lack of places on the left leading to places on the right. It's a real symptom of some of the ways we live, some of the neighbourhoods we've been, built, places we've been creating for the last 60, 70 years, that you get a symptom of, sprawling road network. And I really liked Gary's challenge of, do we need all the roads we have? Well, unless we do intensify some of the places, some of the suburbs, as I referred to earlier, then we're not going to be able to get rid of those and allow people to move around. And what does that look like? And again, thinking about the National Model Design Code and some of the planning reform, if we can embed into this a need to have mixed use, an ability to kind of recreate high streets and centres at the heart of our new developments, we can help with creating more walkable places. This is some Space Syntax work and Prince Foundation work on assessing two different places, both in Bristol. They give it a walk score, which is classified by how many services you can reach within a certain time period. And I know there's been reference already to 15 and 20-minute neighbourhoods. Both of them suburbs in Bristol, one has 64 out of 100, and you can see the red on the top left is the smattering of retail and commercial and jobs, and on the right, where you have it concentrated in one place, it's not going to make it easy for anyone outside that immediate vicinity to actually walk there and get there. So what else is coming out? We've got potentially we've got a new manual for streets, which is coming out, and linked to that, a much greater focus on Active Travel and Active Travel England, who have a nice carrot of $2 billion budget, which can help lead to hopefully more places like this, and creating, what's important there is creating safe infrastructure. I think, something I'd like to see in Man Streets and in this is more talk, discussion of public transport and how do we link public transport into some of the planning reform as well. One of the final aspects I want to pick up on planning reform is a real sort of will for more bottom-up planning. So neighbourhood groups coming together. There's, I think, 2,600 neighbourhood groups who are looking to take advantage of neighbourhood planning. And what they can do, whether it's tactical urbanism, you can see parklets, and you've probably walked around your towns and cities and seen lots of things like this. This photo of Northcote Road. Things that are slightly temporary, and if they work and people enjoy them, and I know there was huge sort of footfall and retail uplift here, they can become permanent. Some of the neighbourhood groups we're working with are incredibly focused on air pollution, and we're looking at creating a neighbourhood design code from the bottom up to help. This is a CGI, unfortunately, but one day to help plant more street trees, create more walkable neighbourhoods, start to have an environment which people, rather than driving through, which this is at the moment, will be a place where people might actually have a coffee, go and shop, go and work, and spend more time. And then finally, just a will obviously for more school streets, which is, I think there's all but 2 London boroughs at the moment have school streets. And I think a really exciting policy to sort of protect the health of people that need it the most. And hopefully, instead of planning for the past, we can start to plan for the future. That's everything. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And so we're going to move on to picking up some of the questions. And I see we've got some really interesting questions that have come in. So thank you for all those who've submitted them. Firstly, I just wanted to pose to Bill about the impacts of the COVID pandemic on air quality. So we heard a lot of people saying they felt air quality had improved during the lockdown period. They'd noticed improvements in air quality. What did COVID tell us about air pollution at a local level, and does it give us an insight into the future?
Yeah, thanks for that, Suzanne. Yes, none of us mentioned COVID already, did we? So I think in the first COVID lockdown in March last year, we saw massive reductions in traffic levels and of course associated economic activity. And we saw big improvements in air quality. We saw NO2 levels fall a lot in our cities, driven by the changes in traffic. But it's a little bit complicated because the weather also changed. And it's kind of hard to remember, but in February last year, we were looking at record flooding events and Storm George and things. And then in April, May last year, everyone went to Bournemouth Beach because the weather was so good. So the weather influenced some of those changes, but we did see big shifts, maybe 30 to 40%, due to the traffic changes in NO2 in our cities. But I think probably what's more powerful than the numbers is that they showed people what the difference could be. And I think it marked a bit of a step change in public engagement for a lot of the interventions that we've seen since then around active travel and some of the ideas that David was illustrating just now.
Thanks, Bill. That leads us very nicely actually into our next question, and thank you to Mark Strong for this. So, well aware of some of the controversies that there have been around some of those changes which were introduced really as a result of the COVID pandemic. So, for example, low traffic neighbourhoods and active travel schemes. How can we get the message across that improving air quality means making meaningful changes? So, Gary, I was interested in your thoughts here.
Goodness me, I think that's very difficult at the moment. The community that David talked about with Choked Up are very concerned about things like low traffic neighbourhoods and whether they're leading to displacement of traffic away from leafy, rich suburbia onto busy roads where poorer people live. And I think it's just very difficult at the moment to be trying to bring about modal shift and changes that's taking people away from private travel onto public transport. And that, I think, is making things really, really difficult at the moment. It's interesting listening to William before about changes to do with COVID, but some of the things we've seen is really huge improvements in air pollution, for instance, in the centre of London, and in suburban areas, we're just not seeing the same, because many more people are around in these suburban areas and many more people are trying to drive rather than, I think, take public transport, because the busy road at the end, just a couple of 30 odd meters away from my house, the buses are empty, the road's absolutely chocker. So I think it's very difficult, but we need to be pursuing this agenda of actually trying to reduce road capacity, repurpose our streets, and if we can induce people through that to be able to change the way in which they travel, then I think that's the route to a solution. But I think that probably hasn't quite answered your question, has it?
Certainly the Transition Clean Air Network has a focus on transport decarbonisation, and we know that that is going to drive many of the changes in our transport systems. Picking up on that, I mean, interesting question here about the future of how do we manage car usage. So what kind of road pricing could be implemented without penalising people in areas of distributed retail and social infrastructure and services where there's inadequate public transport or other, such as on-demand hail and ride facilities. So David, did you want to pick up on that from a sort of transport linked to infrastructure delivery perspective?
Yeah, and another big question. I think I guess one of the crucial bits there that you mentioned is places that aren't currently served well by public transport. And I think what's incredibly important is that when we're planning new neighbourhoods, places, developments, that it's not just sort of where's the most convenient airfield that we can build a load of houses on, but we actually start to think about what's the infrastructure that needs to go in place before that, so that we don't create a lot of the places that we already have created and are trying to retrofit. I think that's one sort of step to get going on. On road pricing, I think, we've got the ULEZ, which is going to be expanding, and it might be that actually the bigger the area and the more holistically you think, in terms of city size, that helps to make sure it's not just a micro area which is benefiting and might create more traffic. I know a lot of the research seems to be showing that there's reductions in traffic levels both within and without a lot of the LTNs, and I'm sure basically needs to be very well planned to ensure that, and that the bigger scale that you actually get to, the better the chance is that you can have clean air for all, which I think is probably what we're all trying to do, isn't it?
And if we think about how much can we do, let's say at a local and regional level versus what is outside the control of authorities here, Bill, I'm interested in your answer to if we woke up tomorrow with no air pollution issues, so no generation of pollutant sources essentially in the UK, would we continue to have poor air pollution, for example, from the continent? And this is this issue of local versus national versus international contributors.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So a portion of our air pollution derives from outside the UK, a relatively small amount in terms of NO2, a larger but not dominant component in terms of fine particles. And one of the kind of key things for us is to have the monitoring networks that can allow us to put numbers on some of those aspects. I think something that's quite related to that, though, is when we talk about air pollution and climate change, a lot of the causes are similar in terms of burning things, how we power our cities and how we move around our traffic. But the interventions that we take to reduce air pollution emissions will deliver local air quality benefits and local health benefits. And that contrasts slightly with the climate benefits, which are more global. So I think that also comes into understanding the local health benefit from local air quality improvements from planning our cities differently. So take that question a slightly differently.
And on the topic of measurements and our infrastructure that's in place, the DEFRA AURN network of air quality sensors, do you think that we have enough information on air quality to quantify the success of strategies, or do you think we need more investment in measurements? So Bill, I'm interested in your thoughts, and perhaps Gary as well here.
I think we need to be driven by improving the health of people. And a lot of that is focused by knowing what the air quality is where people are. So we probably want to get a little bit away from deciding if air quality is above or below 40 micrograms and trying to reduce air pollution for everyone. But that's going to be a little bit tensioned about recognizing that people living in places with the worst air quality also suffer some of the worst other socioeconomic factors in their neighborhoods. And there's maybe an equity as well as an equality issue wrapped up in that.
And Gary, did you want to expand upon that at all?
Just to really support what Bill said, I think we need to get away from just this tick, do we achieve the limit value, yes or no? And we need to understand why. So if we're above it, we need to understand why. And undoubtedly, you know, the health evidence says there's no real such thing as a threshold. And once we achieve the limits, you know, it's not as though suddenly the air is perfectly clean. We have to be setting about policies that are bringing about improvements for everyone. And bringing that back to planning, that's something we don't really have at the moment. So if you look into the sort of professional guidance from IAQM around building inside and outside air quality management areas, so these are the most polluted places, it's a lot easier to put a polluting, let's say, car park or something like that in an area that's already clean. So what we have within our planning process is that the limit values aren't just a waypoint on the way to clean air. In many cases, they're actually seen as a ceiling to pollute up to. And that's not supported by the health evidence at all. So that needs to be changed.
So David, I mean, the planning white paper talks about net benefits from developments rather than harms. I mean, should we be undertaking health-based impact assessments for all developments?
I mean, it sounds like a pretty sensible idea. I was sort of thinking as well when Gary was talking about that, you know, making it easier to build where there's good areas, quite similar to the way that we sort of build roads as well at the moment, in that it's probably a lot easier to, you know, build an area that doesn't have a lot of existing traffic on its road network, whereas actually those areas are probably exactly where we do need to be building a few more. You know, it's a system, isn't it? And you kind of want to be putting more homes closer to the places where people are going to work, you know, go to school, etc. And thinking about how can those homes best kind of serve sustainable lifestyles and therefore, you know, lower polluting lifestyles. But I think having linking health benefits and health outcomes, I could see that being definitely quite useful. I do think with the targets, I can, as much as they could be quite difficult to, you know, to say once you've achieved them, got under a threshold, you know, tick the box, you can move on. But I do think it's quite important that we keep pushing ourselves with those targets. And I don't know if there's any other way of kind of, you know, measuring and therefore hope, you know, improving our air quality in, you know, towns and cities.
I think it's important that we actually have a set of policies that just brings about improvements for everyone in their exposure. We've done some studies in London and we've found that if you look at the period from about 2005 to about 2015, then alongside many roads and for many communities, air pollution was actually deteriorating for those times. And we need policies in place that just bring about improvements for all communities, really.
So our air quality targets, really, is it the wrong way around that we have the legislation at the moment? Would we be actually better measuring the amount of time that that particular people are exposed in excess of targets? And also, should we be applying World Health Organization health-based targets?
If I may, I'll just quickly say, I don't think we should be measuring time that people spend above targets. We should be looking at the whole integrated exposure that people have. But I'll let others answer the other parts of the question.
Well, I'm interested in your thoughts here, and we've got a question related to that about the World Health Organization limit for PM 2.5 and the revision at the moment. So which limit should we be aiming for?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should be aiming to for the 10 micrograms per cubic meter WHO limit. But I think we should also be informed by whatever the revision of limits comes up with. The 2019 air quality strategy sets the ambition to halve the number of people nationally who live in areas above that 10 micrograms limit. But the new air quality standard for the UK will be set as part of the Environment Bill, which has just been removed from passage through the Commons and is sort of on ice again, probably until September, when we'll get a first sense of what the national air quality target for PM 2.5 is. And that'll be a really key measure of our ambition for air quality to protect health in the country. And if it's set in terms of reducing exposure rather than meeting level X, or a combination of those two things.
And of course, if we're looking to the future, what about emerging pollutants? So we've talked a lot about PM 2.5 micrometers or below, but what about those even finer particles? So the ultrafine particles, or those that we're really only just beginning to understand how to measure and how to quantify. Should we be focusing on them?
I think we should be concerned about them. There's bits of it, there's emerging health evidence that says that we should be taking these a lot more seriously. And you've got to say, maybe from a policy perspective, you would say, well, okay, I've already got, you know, in my city, I've got these measures already in place on traffic. I'm doing certain other things. Hopefully I'm covering not just the PM 2.5, but I'm covering the tiny particles as well. However, that's not the case. There are some sources that are really huge sources of tiny ultrafine particles that aren't really being picked up by the current policy sort of landscapes. And one of the largest ones there is airports. The volume of small particles that comes from Heathrow is such that we can detect it in central London. And that's similarly the case in many of Europe's other cities. You can sit there in the center of the city, and if you make the right measurements, you can detect the small particles from the airport, even though the air has traveled perhaps over tens of kilometers for urban area before it reaches you. So a change to regulating the small particles may really change the types of action we have to take as well.
Fascinating. And also, what about engaging with local communities? So I know we're going to be heading to wrap up this session, and many fascinating insights that we've had and plenty to explore, but I'm really interested in, do you think we should be sharing knowledge with communities, and is that being done well? So David.
We should definitely be sharing knowledge, I think, as much as possible. And I mean, it's definitely a topic that so many community groups increasingly, whether it's wrapped up with sustainability, but you know, as we know, air quality is much more localized, so people feel that they definitely can have more of an impact locally on that and trying to improve it. So using, I guess, some of the tools that are available, there's obviously campaigning, you know, broad campaigning using digital tools to kind of get you know, hundreds of people on side to go to your local politicians to ask for quieter streets, better cycling facilities, low traffic neighbourhoods, school streets, but also using neighbourhood planning and neighbourhood design codes to, you know, put that framework in place for your, you know, wider area. And if, you know, we get thousands of these, then that's going to sort of drive that bottom-up change.
And finally, Gary, yes, I was going to say yes or no. Are scientists doing enough to share their knowledge with local communities? Should they do more?
No is the answer. There are a huge number of scientists who are poring away over computer models and sophisticated stainless steel setups measuring all sorts of intricacies in our air pollution, and they don't really engage with the people that are breathing that air.
And Bill, should we be doing more with our local communities?
Yeah, I think it's critical. I think engagement and informing people empowers them to influence the decisions that affect how we live our lives now and in the future. So I think it's absolutely critical.
If I could just slip in with a supplementary, we frame this so much as we must empower the individual to take a different decision or to change their lives. There's a couple that wrote to me quite regularly for some time, an elderly couple from southeast London, and they've been moved into a block of flats since the bloke, the husband, couldn't really deal with the stairs in their house anymore because of his breathing problems. And they were put in a set of flats that were really nice, but their only windows opened up onto a main road. And they opened up the windows to get some air in the summer, and this would exacerbate his COPD. And they would write to me regularly saying, what can we do about this? And telling them and empower, no matter how much we could empower them with information, there is no way that they could influence the traffic on the road outside. So what this actually requires is for those people that are in government and beyond government, for those people that control businesses and everything else, they're the people that have to enable others to make change.
Wrap up and bring this to a close, but before we do so, we've got another question for you, the audience, as well. So over to Constance for our final question. So having heard what you have this evening, would you now consider air quality when you're renting or buying your next home? Again, submit your answer live. Well, it certainly looks as though what we have heard has had an impact in terms of perceptions of air quality, and of course that is now publicly available. You can plug in your postcode and find out if your home or the home you want interested in renting or buying exceeds WHO health-based PM 2.5 limit values. So I'd like to really say a huge thank you this evening. I think we've heard some fascinating insights. It's a tremendously broad topic area, but certainly I think a few key messages that I've certainly heard this evening, that the air quality isn't an individual issue. We heard the tragic case of Ella Kisidebra, and of course we heard about how it's a community issue as well. Collectively, the action is not just local, but also regional, national and international. I think it's also been very evident that it's a health issue as much as, if not more than, an environmental issue, and the links through to climate action, obviously in the year of COP26, are absolutely critical. I also sense we have a lot of knowledge already out there. We have a lot of knowledge in the scientific community, which we can harness and we can use to work with communities and work with authorities, and much that we know we could use and we could apply for air quality action. There are clearly opportunities in the proposals within the planning white paper and with regard to the way we think about development in order to really have a better vision for the future of our towns and cities that are high quality places to live and where people can enjoy and have prosperous and healthy lives. So thank you very much. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I'd like to thank all of our expert speakers and of course Create Streets as well for hosting us this evening, and you yourself, the audience, for listening. Thank you.
Suzanne, thank you so much. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you all for listening. Huge thank you to the University of Birmingham Institute for Global Innovation and the Transition Network for kindly sponsoring this evening. From sometime tomorrow, I don't want to commit to a precise time, the video of this webinar will be available on the Create Streets YouTube account. So do go and pick that up, and please do share it with people, very much in the spirit of spreading the message. One final thought, if I may. I am a glass half full sort of guy, and I think the genie is out of the bottle of this one. The awareness, the metaphorical school gate of this issue is just growing and growing over the last few years. I think the nature of the politics of this is changing. It used to be perhaps slightly closer to a partisan issue. I think we're not at a consensus yet, but I think we're pretty close to it in the way the local politics is playing out. It's certainly becoming more the case. And I think those final words of Suzanne's, I think Gary's final slide, sorry, I'm picking on William by not citing him, but also David's final slide. William's slides are all great as well. Actually, that vision of a future where we can lead more connected, more sustainable, happier, more beautiful and healthier lives, breathing cleaner air and walking around more, is in all the stats is a vision that people are increasingly buying into. So I think we will get there. I just don't quite know how quickly we'll get there. And in that, I guess, let's all try and do our best to get us there quicker. Thank you all. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you to the panelists, and good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you.